almost Friday. Earth Week is
Friday Eve.
still Earth Week. Um, Today we're going to be talking about LNT principles 5 and 6, which are
Number 5 is campfire management, very, very important. And then number 6 is respect wildlife. You're out there with them, so you got to respect them.
so we're going to start with Allison. Enjoy her video.
Alright guys, so the very first LNT principle that we're going to talk about today is LNT principle number 5, which is minimize campfire impacts. So campfires are actually really impactful on the natural environment. I mean, fires in general, just picture a forest fire. But fires, will scorch the ground beneath where they're burning and either kill off little plants that are growing there, but also a lot of the microorganisms and microbiota that live in the soil. And so it's really, really important that when we decide to build a fire, we are doing it with leave no trace in mind so that we're not disturbing too much of the natural environment. The greatest impact, I think there's kind of an expectation that when you go camping, you're going to have a campfire. And so this increased demand for fires and firewood, has created this market for wood. And that can have kind of an impact on sustainability, where there's a whole industry committed to logging for firewood for campgrounds. A lot of campgrounds can kind of find down trees on their land that they then cut up to create firewood for their established campgrounds. But there is a pretty significant demand for wood, for firewood, for burning, and that it's important to recognize that has an impact on sustainability and on our earth. I think it's kind of old school now to cook over a fire, and so a lot of times when people are embarking upon outdoor excursions, building a fire isn't really necessary for sustenance anymore. There are some really, really cool camp stoves out there. There are lightweight ones for backpacking, and then there are bigger Coleman ranges that you can use for car camping, and that can pretty much negate your need for a cook fire. But still, having a campfire I think is a really important experience. For camping, it's just important that if you decide to build a fire, when you decide to build a fire, that you are doing it sustainably and appropriately. So the first thing to decide when you are on your outdoor excursion is, should you build a fire in the first place? And that can kind of be dependent upon, the area that you are recreating in. So if you're staying at an established campground, say Big Meadows in Shenandoah National Park, oftentimes that the managers of that campsite have put in these permanent campfire rings. I think that, that's a familiar thing for a lot of people, these big, iron pits that have grates that fold over them, and then you can buy firewood from the ranger station and build your fire in there. That's a really good, I guess, kind of model to follow if you do decide to try and build a fire in the backcountry. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to build a fire outside of an established fire ring, you should really think carefully about how necessary your fire is. It's possible that you're in a situation where you need to build a fire for a survival situation, and that, in that situation you come first and you should build a fire to keep yourself safe. But, if you're on a backpacking trip and you're in, say, alpine wilderness, which is a little more delicate, you should kind of check yourself and say, okay, do I really need to build a fire? And if you think that you do, try and make sure that you're doing it on a durable surface. So I think a lot of people think that a big rock outcropping is a good place to build a fire, but those scorch marks, those burn marks that it'll leave on the rock can actually have, a lasting visual impact on that natural area. And so the best place to build a fire is, kind of a dusty, dirt covered surface, where you can kind of dig in a little pit. Try to avoid, building fires over delicate vegetation. If you can build a fire in sand, if you can build a fire on snow, all the principles that we went over in our hiking camp and durable surfaces video, which went out on Tuesday, can be applied to building a campfire. One thing that's important to assess when you're deciding whether or not you should build a fire is what's the fire danger? In Virginia tends to be pretty wet, and so fire danger tends to be pretty low. But, if you're adventuring out west, oftentimes there can be fire bans, just like at California. California's a perfect example. I think it's 4 out of 5 forest fires are man-made. Those aren't necessarily born from campfires, but man-made of some kind, and campfires definitely attribute to that risk. So make sure that you're researching your area before you go out. That's principle number 1, plan ahead and prepare. Make sure that there are no fire bans. Make sure you're aware of the fire danger, how dry the area is, how long it's been since there's been rainfall, and that will really heavily influence your decision of whether or not you should build a fire in the backcountry. Another thing to consider is, do you need a permit? So a lot of wilderness areas require permitting to build a fire. I think that's more common out west than it is out here, but make sure that you're calling, double checking with your ranger station to find out about bans and permitting. And then another thing is just like, do you have the resources around you? You know, if you're camping in a really heavily wooded area, chances are you can find some dry, dead wood lying around. But if you're camping in, you know, an alpine meadow or a desert, a beach, it might be a lot harder to find wood. And so make sure that whatever resources you're going to need to build your fire isn't going to be having a steeper impact on the environment that you're camping in. If you do go ahead and decide to build a fire, which, you know, let's be honest, is an excellent experience to have a campfire. It really like rounds out a camping experience, and we all love that. So if you do decide that it's within your ethics to build a fire, you know, try and build a fire that is going to be as leave no trace as possible. So the first way that you can do that is, you know, try and find an existing structure. Try and find a fire ring that's already in place so you don't have to build a new one. If you're at a big established campground, likely this is going to be like, you know, right in the middle of your campground. But if you're in a more backcountry setting, maybe try and build like a makeshift campfire ring. You can dig out a little pit and set up rocks around it and then kind of build your fire in there, but try and contain it. You can also bring a fire pan, which is like a big aluminum pan. It looks like a big like cake pan, and you can build a fire in that, and that will leave, you know, no visible marking on the earth below your fire. Or you can do what's called building an LNT fire, where you just keep it really, really small, and you don't use logs that are like, or sticks, I guess, that are any thicker than your finger. You keep it a really, really tiny teepee-like fire. That'll leave less of an impact on the ground beneath, wherever you decide to burn. Try to avoid using live wood and live leaves. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you decide to build a fire, but the only resources you have around you can get from like ripping limbs off trees, you know, that's not particularly ethical, that's not particularly sustainable. So make sure that if you do decide to build a fire, that you're only using things that have already fallen to the ground. And even then be careful, because a lot of small animals use fallen wood and fallen trees as shelter. So if you're going to pull dead, dry wood from the ground, make sure that you pull it from a relatively wide area. You know, don't pick like a 3x3 block and then pull all of your firewood from that area. Because then, you know, when other visitors come through or when other animals come through, there's this whole sparse patch of where you left your impact of your fire from gathering that wood. Another thing is, you know, after your fire is done, make sure you let it burn down completely. Just because there are no more visible flames doesn't mean that your fire is not hot, and it doesn't mean that your fire can't restart. So I think that a lot of people will build a campfire and then go to bed while the coals are still burning. And if the wind picks up at night, which it often does, they can actually relight that fire. And then there's nobody watching it, and so there's no really control of that fire. And those sparks can fly and be blown into dry debris that's nearby, and you can start something bigger than you maybe intended to build. And that's how those wildfires, those uncontrolled burns can start. So make sure that you're either staying up to watch your fire burn completely out, or you're making what's called like ash slurry. And so we always put our fire out with water. We don't use dirt. Dirt is way less effective than putting out a fire than water is. And so make sure that you're using a little bit of water and kind of like stirring it into your ashes and putting the ashes out until they're cold. So before you go to bed at night, your fire should be put out so that it's cold to the touch. That will prevent it from relighting at all. And that's a very LNT principle. That fits into the LNT brand of ethics. And then if you do decide, if you are in a situation where you have to build your own fire structure, your own fire ring, make sure either that night or in the morning when you wake up that you're eliminating your trace of that fire ring. So if you put rocks in a circle, make sure you're throwing those rocks back out into the wilderness surrounding you. And if you have a little ash pit or scorch marks or burn marks below you, take a trowel or some bark and scatter those ashes so that the the impact of your fire that you've just built is not traceable. It never looked like you were there. And so that's the whole point of Leave No Trace and building a Leave No Trace fire, is ask yourself, should you build a fire? And if you do need to build a fire or would like to have a fire, make sure that you're building it responsibly and sustainably and in a way that, if somebody were to come through that area the next day, they never knew that you were there. So Ariane is going to take it away with LNT principle number 6, respect wildlife, and we'll see you at the end of the video.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining. So today we're going to be talking about the 6th principle of LNT, which is respect wildlife. So this one's really important because we encounter wildlife whenever we go outside, if we are at the park or we're at the beach or just going for a walk. So it is really important to remember that we are strangers to animals and that they are very easily startled. So stomping through the woods can actually cause commotion and can be very stressful for them, especially if they live there. So how would you feel if someone came into your home and started to make a commotion? You'd probably feel frazzled and a bit scared and confused. So just remember that when you are going into their home, because you are the visitor. So observing wildlife from a distance. Do not follow them or approach them. You can enjoy wildlife without disturbing them through the lens of your camera or binoculars. So think of the LNT principle number 4, leave what you find, the same thing. So take pictures when you can, so you're not disturbing anything. Learning about wildlife through quiet observation, because you don't want them to get scared and flee, especially if you are in a big group. Try to go into smaller groups so animals don't feel as much anxiousness. Never, 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 never feed animals. We actually encountered this in our spring break trip where we were camping. There was deer that was very, very sick. And the reason for it is they weren't eating properly. They would go to campsite looking for food and people would feed them. So they got used to people feeding them. So they didn't know how to find food on their own. So never feed animals because feeding animals will damage their health and alters their natural behaviors. It also exposes them to predators and other dangers. But just like what we learned at the spring break trip, they will just depend on people rather than finding food on their own. Protect wildlife and your food by storing it properly and securing your trash. We talked about that also in dispose of waste properly, which is LNT number 3. If you do bring your animals, if you bring a dog or if you walk your cat, control them at all times. Do not allow them to chase after other animals that might be on the trail or wherever you are. Avoid wildlife during sensitive times like mating season, nesting, and when they're raising their young. Especially mothers, they become overprotective, and if you get too close to their young, they actually might attack. So trying to keep, again, that distance whenever possible. And also, like we talked about in LNT principle 3, dispose of your waste properly. You want to remember that 200 feet rule, so about 70 pieces. Try to stay away from water sources. This is not only your water source, it is the animal's water source. So if you're camping too close to it, if you are dumping your waste in the water, now their water is also contaminated. And again, this is their home. We are the visitors. Try to be respectful to the wildlife whenever possible.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to our Leave No Trace videos with the Tribe Adventure program.
I hope you enjoyed them.
We're really excited to be here with you guys to celebrate Earth Week. And make sure that you go and check out the other videos that are being posted, the webinars by everybody across William and Mary.
There's some really good ones, and you should go and check those out.
Yeah, let's help rep sustainability and think about ways that you can apply the Leave No Trace principles into your own life. Watch out for our video tomorrow.